Okay, I think we're gonna start. So thank you everyone for joining in. This is part of the NASA Carbon Monitoring System CMS Policy Speaker Series, this one for March 2023. And today we're honored in welcoming three extraordinary panelists. We have Deborah Gordon from RMI, that she has been engaged with CMS for many years now, Kenzie Hoffman from Carbon Mapper, and Lekha Sridhar from What Time and Climate Trace. So before moving to this talk is going to be basically discussing key takeaways from last COP27. All these panelists, they have been participating in these COP conferences for years now. And then we'll be talking about what to expect from this upcoming COP28 that is going to happen in Dubai. So before moving with the talk, I just wanted to mention a couple of announcements, and also very important, like how the engagement of NASA during these COP conferences, as you see here. This is the media advisory that was sent out just a couple of days before the last COP that happened in Egypt, and the participation of NASA at COP, the agency's vantage point from space, provides critical information to advance the understanding of our changing planet, including impacts from greenhouse gas emissions. That is kind of like the focus of the work in CMS. Last year, there were some people from NASA participating at COP. You can see there Kate Colvin, that is the NASA chief scientist and senior climate advisor, was there. And also we had Laura Lorenzoni and Mike Folkowski, that they're both at NASA Earth Science Division in NASA headquarters, and they are some of the program managers that oversee the CMS program. I just wanted to take your attention also as part of the CMS Science Team Meeting and Applications Workshop that we held every year during the fall. We have been doing the last couple of years panels trying to engage some of the CMS funded scientists with policy and decision makers as we prepare for COP. So last year, we held the first in-person meeting since the pandemic. It was in Washington, D.C. You can see a photo there. We had a panel on the role of remote sensing and CMS science in COP27. It was moderated by Ben Poulter from NASA Goddard. We had some stakeholders like Stephen Germain from Greenhouse Gas Sat, Ritesh from EDF, Sierra Woodruff from the US Department of State. And I just wanted to mention very quickly, kind of key takeaways, huge interest in methane. And we have seen that in the last couple of years, especially in our CMS stakeholder community. And key takeaway from that panel, it was said that we must accelerate global collaboration in greenhouse gas monitoring, provide global transparency in emissions, and support indices and the global stocktake and drive action. I wanted to mention that we're going to have a panel on COP28, preparing for COP28, similar to this one, on the CMS Science Team Meeting and Applications Workshop that is going to happen this fall. The dates, I understand, are going to be September 26th to the 28th, and probably the meeting will be either in Denver or Pasadena. We'll send more information about that. So that's just that you all are aware of that. Just quickly about, for those of you that don't know about the carbon monitoring system, you can know more going to our website. It has revamped, is more user-friendly right now, so you can go carbon.nasa.gov. There's going to be information about stakeholders there. And then you can also download our phase 2 synthesis report to find more information about the scope, findings, gap, and recommend the next steps of this CMS initiative. And I always want to mention, if you are considering publishing a paper related to carbon monitoring, you can consider this a special session on the journal Environmental Research Letters. And then just finally, to take your attention, if you haven't heard about this Applied Earth Observation Innovation Partnership, it's a partnership between NASA, US Forest Service, CMS is very involved, and we're going to have a workshop the last week of April. You can go to aeoip.com for more information, or just send me an email if you have any questions. So we'll stop there. And again, we're happy to welcome these three panelists that we have. Debbie Gordon, Kenzie Hoffman, uh, and Leka Sirdar, and we're gonna be talking about how will next generation technology affect climate talks. And we'll start with Leka Sridhar, that is, she is senior policy analyst at What Time. I'm gonna stop sharing here, and Leka, you can take it away from your side.
Um, Please bear with me a second while I get my screen sharing functioning. There we go. Great. Is that visible for everyone?
Yes,
Great. I'm also having a little bit of internet troubles, and if my audio quality isn't clear, just let me know, and I'll stop my video, and maybe that'll help.
perfect. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Really happy to be here. Yeah, as Adil said, I'm a senior policy analyst at What Time, which is one of the organizations that's part of the Climate Trees Coalition. And on behalf of Climate Trees, I manage external research collaborations. So I will be talking about
Sorry,
some of the key
Leka,
takeaways.
one more. Sorry to interrupt. I think you have to like hit the
Oh,
presentation.
yep,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
Yep, sorry.
Sorry for like.
Yes. So let me just, there we go. Yep. Is that
Perfect.
fine?
Thank you. Go back again. It went.
Oh, great. Yes.
There you go. Thank you.
Great.
It goes back. I don't know why.
Mm, would it be possible for you to share your screen? I think I'm having some technical trouble. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. You know what? I can share the screen if you want.
That would be great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Let's do that. Mm, uh, This is what happens when we have live um, meetings through WebEx. Okay, we're gonna have this now. There you go.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. I will be talking about some of the key takeaways and the conversations that happened at COP27 this year. And of course, Kenzie and Debbie will talk more about what's coming up in COP28 as well. Next slide, please. Before I start, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to Climate Trees. We are a joint initiative founded by a number of collaborating universities, nonprofits, tech startups, and environmental leaders, and dozens of other organizations who have contributed additional data and expertise. Our approach is to, at a very high level, to incorporate different types of satellite imagery that have been collected by various space agencies, and our system use artificial intelligence trained to spot activity indicators of greenhouse gas emissions in satellite imagery, like steam plumes from power plants or hotspots in steel plants. These indicators are then linked to ground truth data sets collected from ground-based sensors and government data sets and other sources of information in data-rich regions. And then these models can then be deployed in regions that traditionally may not have had access to granular data on greenhouse gas emissions. With that, let me jump to some of the discussions that were happening at COP27. Next slide, please. So quick background on Earth observation data in climate negotiations. So while satellite data has become extremely important in monitoring climate risk and it's well recognized in how important it is for adaptation efforts, its use in climate negotiations for measuring emissions is still pretty nascent. In fact, it was only the 2019 refinement to the IPCC National Inventory Guidelines that clearly laid out how Earth observation data could, and inverse modeling tools could be used as data sources by countries in their quality assurance and quality control processes while preparing their inventories. As a result, there's only a handful of countries today that actually use satellite measurements in their national emission reporting, and they're currently used for methane emissions, nitrous oxide, and in some cases, F gases. Next slide, please. That said, oh, next slide, please. There we go. Yeah. Climate negotiations can and have incentivized the deployment of Earth observation-based approaches by countries. The previous slide, please. Um, after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, several countries, particularly in the global south, have put in place policies, institutions, systems, and networks that improve data collection, have improved local observation networks and information management systems, because they're kind of required to have all of these in place for the enhanced transparency framework, which comes into effect next year. They've also begun to develop regional models and scenarios that can enhance the and have started to fund technical capacity building and training of technical experts, which are of course fantastic in creating a better picture of emissions and climate issues, but also support the overall technical and scientific progress in these countries. Next slide, please. So what were some of the big Earth observation highlights that happened at COP27 this year? So there were three decisions that happened. The big one was the Global Climate Observing Systems 2022 implementation plan was adopted by all the parties. The GCOS program is co-sponsored by a number of multilateral organizations, including the WMO. It assesses the status of global climate observation uh, systems and suggests improvements every few years. The 2022 plan presented a few practical action items. Big one was massively increasing engagement with countries, particularly countries that don't have a lot of technical expertise currently in the use of Earth observation data, and to support them in the use of this data for their emissions reporting. Other big recommendations were also to increase in situ observations in regions which have a lot of data gaps, particularly in parts of Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and polar regions. UNEP also launched the methane alert and response system, but I won't talk about that because I know Debbie will have a lot to say about that. And finally, the early warnings for all action plan was also launched, which is mainly focused on climate risk, of course, but it also called for additional funding for systematic observation initiatives, and particularly they called for additional financing of the Systematic Observations Finance Facility, which provides long-term financial assistance to enable countries to acquire and exchange basic weather and climate data. In fact, several additional Annex 1 countries committed to providing new funding for the facility at COP27, which is, of course, extremely beneficial. Next slide, please. Well, Debbie's going to be talking about what to expect at COP28 in much greater detail. The one thing I do want to mention is that the one big conversation that was everywhere at COP last year was the global stocktake, which of course the process started at COP26 in Glasgow and has been ongoing, and the findings are going to be released at COP28. So there were a number of technical dialogues and roundtables that happened at COP and have been occurring throughout. There's also been a submission process that I believe closed last week. I think the encouraging thing was a number of organizations, research organizations, and space agencies have submitted comments to the process, calling that for the global stocktake process to make sure that they also include Earth observation data in the global stocktake process. So that is while we can't see the results just yet. It seems very likely that Earth observation data is going to play a very big role. The other interesting thing was also that the synthesis reports that were prepared for the technical assessments under the global stocktake also assess the systematic observation capacity building done by countries. What they said in their NDCs regarding capacity building, and also identified where the biggest gaps were. So this could be a really useful next step and a good building block for when the second and third will start to happen. Slide 7. Next slide, please. While we've made significant progress in advancing Earth observation data for decision making in the climate negotiations, clearly there's a lot more room for a lot more engagement. 2024, as I mentioned, is the year when countries will start to implement the enhanced transparency framework, and particularly for non-Annex 1 countries who've been submitting much kind of high level GHG inventories required to submit much more detailed information. It's very clear that Earth observation data and kind of building up the capacity is going to be really important in ensuring that they can actually meet the requirements of the ETF. And also, there is a need for more geographic diversity, not just in the data collection, but also in the kinds of research organizations and the collaborations that happen in the scientific community. And in addition to what's happening at the UNFCCC, that parties, the countries are required to submit their official inventories. There has also been a lot of progress on corporate emissions reporting. Like the EU recently passed new regulation, a lot more industries, much wider reporting requirements by companies. In the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission has also proposed new rules proposing to standardize climate-related disclosures and reporting. And also last year, the UN Secretary General established a high-level expert group on net zero emission commitments by state entities. They published their report calling for a much more standardized manner of reporting so that companies greenwashing or just claiming net zero, that having achieved net zero without actually having done so. Engaging with these initiatives by the Earth observation community would be a big opportunity, and making sure that country inventories, sub-national inventories, and corporate inventories are all tied to each other. That would be a really important step to making sure that they all speak with each other in the same language. Last slide, please. And just aside from Earth observation data, like inverse modeling tools or atmospheric measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, there have also been a lot of new approaches that combine satellite data with other data sets, everything from smart device metadata, traffic congestion information, and trade flows, all of which show a lot of progress in enhancing climate data, and definitely should be engaged with closely and in future climate negotiations. With that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Leka. For that, Leka has to, I think she has until 12:30. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the other two presentations. But if you have a quick question, we have time for one quick question for Leka. We have time now for a question. And you can unmute yourself if anyone has a question, or you can raise your hand. Ned Harvey asks if there has been any discussion on the hybrid approach to carbon monitoring that we talked about a few weeks ago.
I'm not familiar with what was discussed a few weeks ago. If you could say a little bit more.
Ned.
Yeah, I was trying to find the report. There, okay. One of these meetings, I think two, maybe 3 weeks ago, there was a National Academy study, and the principal investigator was on talking about it. It was basically a report on carbon monitoring for decision makers, and they had proposed the need to migrate from a purely activity based or purely top down to much more of a hybrid based model where you were combining kind of the best of all worlds into smart, predictive, reliably things. And I'm curious if that's getting taken up in the COP conversations, and if there's a move towards that, away from sort of more mechanical standards.
Absolutely, there was. In fact, even the GST, the technical assessments that were done did specifically mention the importance of these integrated systems that combine top-down and kind of bottom-up inventory approaches. So for sure.
Thank you, Ned.
And I guess the following question, that would be just the importance of connecting what our policymakers use to actual decision support systems that work in the real economy.
Sorry, could you say that again? I missed what you said.
Sorry, I've probably taken too much time, but I think one of the emphasis was that the top-down approach kind of works well for policy and regulatory work. You can encode that into law and all that, but it doesn't work great for actual decision making, whether it's on policy or in the real economy. And so the focus on bridging that gap and including real economy decision making and things versus that was also, I thought, part of the subtext. So, hopefully that's being taken up as well.
I mean, like it ought to be, but of course, in the UNFCCC context, monitoring, reporting, and verification is about what has been done, and it isn't necessarily always focused on decision making that flows from that. But I agree, it's probably the subtext there.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you, Leica, for your time. If you have any other questions, I think she's gonna hang around for like 10 more minutes, so you can post that on the chat and she can answer that. So we're gonna go to our second speaker, and we'll do Kenzie and then Debbie, one after the other, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion with them. So Kenzie from Carbon Mapper.
Can you see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So it's lovely to be with you all today and to talk a little bit about the policy landscape and kind of where we're going. This is much closer to my background on the policy side than the day-to-day science of what a lot of my Carbon Mapper colleagues tend to focus on. And Ned, I think I'll try to get at a little bit of some of the pieces that you're talking about and talk about some of the methane specific elements where they're trying to bring the kind of direct data that we're observing on the ground into kind of these conversations. So hopefully that'll help to connect some dots. But really, I'm going to talk about how these tools and data can be used to drive action, and specifically in the methane context, because that's a lot of what we focus on. So what I thought I would do today is start with the methane policy landscape and really talk a little bit about how it's evolved over the last few years and how the new systems and efforts that are coming online are going to be shaping the landscape, and then talk very briefly about kind of what Carbon Mapper is doing and how we fit in kind of in the broader sense. And so I know Debbie will also have comments on this too, but there's been a huge evolution over the last few years on methane, in particular within the global context. So the conversation had really focused mostly before a couple years ago on nonprofits and philanthropy pushing companies, and we actually saw companies responding to this. So a lot of corporates actually started building methane targets within their net zero plans and their own targets, and that was huge. But from a global policy perspective, it really wasn't a focus. And so COP26 was actually a really big turning point from this from a global stage. We saw a lot of countries coming together to pledge their commitment to the global methane pledge, which was reducing global methane emissions 30% by 2030. And by COP27, more than 150 countries had signed on. And a lot of you know this, so I know it's not news. But this also dovetails with what Leica was talking about, which is a greater focus on methane within the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, and their inventory work as well. The other big kind of shift on this was philanthropy really stepped up in a coordinated way to bridge a lot of these gaps and to bring these actors together. So, all these countries had come together to really set this ambition, but there was a lot of worry about how they could actually meet that ambition and actually get there. And so philanthropy actually came in and said, this is really a role that we tend to fill, they kind of act as bridges between governments and nonprofits and companies. And so they stepped up and raised over $325 million to support the Global Methane Pledge. And they actually created a body called the Global Methane Hub that is actually working with partners and companies and governments around the world to deploy those dollars to really focus on advancing action along methane policy to actually achieve our methane policy goals. We also have seen a lot of countries focusing on updating or creating new methane regulations. So especially in key emitting sectors like oil and gas. And then, there's a ton of action at the subnational level as well here in the US, as well as internationally. But these were all really huge and major signals for action. And so where COP26 was really about setting the ambition, COP27 was really about turning that ambition into action. But I think, as we all know, that takes a lot of time. And so they set the stage for that. And then I think that's really where we're going with COP28 and probably COP29, is continuing to push on how countries are going to deliver methane reductions, not so much what the goals are going to be. And so one really notable announcement along this front from COP27 was a coordinated initiative led by the US State Department, where they took a number of global methane pledge partners, so countries and nonprofits and companies and a whole slew of folks, and they came together to identify and advance efforts along three major pathways: energy, food and agriculture, and waste. And so that is now the kind of focal point for action going forward, and how all of these actors are going to be setting their plans and their strategies to really target getting this data to advance efforts within those three sectoral frameworks. And so this just kind of broadly is a really big shift in the thinking, where they brought all of these different actors and sectors focused on methane together. And it's really important because it is starting to invest in a stronger policy and engagement infrastructure focused on methane that has this kind of global lens, but also thinking really deeply down to the subnational level. So I did want to take just a quick second and step back of like, well, why am I speaking about methane? Why are policymakers now so focused on methane? And a lot of you know this, so I won't belabor it, but just to kind of to highlight it, you know, addressing methane is one of the nearest term opportunities we have to reduce climate change and really buy us enough time to implement longer term solutions that are needed. We see a lot of methane from a number of major sectors, so from oil and gas, coal, waste, and agriculture. And so addressing methane in those sectors provides a real opportunity to tackle climate change. The other thing that is also really relevant to what Carbon Mapper focuses on is that studies have shown that a handful of high emission methane point sources can really contribute in certain places between 20 to 60% of regional methane emissions. And what that means is that identifying and addressing those handful of sources can lead to real impacts on reducing regional emissions. And so this kind of gets at the tiered observing strategy and really leveraging the right tool for the right job, and kind of thinking about how do we bring all of these pieces, these systems, and these data sets together. And the other key thing about tackling methane is that it is often co-emitted with toxics. And so addressing methane can also have real benefits for communities in terms of air quality, health, and environmental justice. And so as Leica mentioned in her presentation, and I know we'll talk more and is a lot of the focus here, is that there's been a lot of growing attention and need for accessible and actionable climate data for decision makers. And what is really, really exciting is that there's this emerging ecosystem of technologies that are looking to address different parts of this methane measurement and monitoring question, and they're all coming together. And we're thinking about them as this kind of tiered observing system or system of systems. And so at COP26, we saw the creation of the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And last year, they announced their methane alert and response program, as Leica mentioned. And this program is specifically focused on leveraging satellite observations to work with partners and operators on the ground to address major methane leaks and events. And so to really try to catch these huge emitting sources and fix them quickly, so that we're actually really starting to drive action on the ground. The other thing is that satellite data is going to play a key role in supporting the work along those global methane pledge pathways that I mentioned, so the ones that are structured along energy, food and agriculture, and waste. And Carbon Mapper will, along with a lot of other partners, including RMI and others, will be contributing to specifically the waste pathway with our observations once our satellites have launched. And then, you know, one thing to just note is that here in the US, the EPA has also begun looking to incorporate satellite observations into their efforts to reduce methane. They recently took comments on something called the Super Emitter Response Program, which seeks to leverage remote sensing point source observations to notify oil and gas operators of major leaks. And so that is just kind of to show the way that satellite data and observations are starting to get integrated into some of these policy frameworks to drive action. And so, you know, as you all know and have a lot of experience in, there is a long history of important and impactful satellite programs like TRPOMI and others that have focused on emissions for a long time. But this emerging ecosystem and suite of tools and technologies are coming online and are really going to start adding to and filling gaps in these observations in really impactful and amazing ways going forward. And so I thought I will just take a brief minute to talk a little bit and give a bit of an overview of how kind of Carbon Mapper fits in and how we're working to support the efforts I talked about. So Carbon Mapper, we're a new nonprofit that was really created to tackle data gaps, but specifically around high emission point sources. And so there's a lot of need for addressing area and regional emissions, and we're really focused on the kind of point source emissions. And we're specifically focused on detecting, pinpointing, and quantifying those emissions. We also have really strong roots in the CMS program, so I know a lot of you are familiar with this. And to do this work, we actually created and lead this really unique public-private partnership that brings together expertise across policy, science, and technology to build something that kind of none of us could do on our own. And this includes NASA JPL, the commercial company Planet Labs, the California Air and Resources Board, RMI, and a number of others. And it's a really amazing partnership. And one of our goals is to develop and deploy methane detecting satellites with this capability at the point source level. And so right now we're working to launch 2 satellites by late 2023 and early 2024 to deliver on this. And a really important element of this partnership and the work we're doing is that all of the methane and CO2 data will be publicly available. Because that's really critical to supporting all of these policy objectives, is that having access to this data is really critical to driving action. And so briefly, this is, and I won't go too far into depth, and we can also talk about this in questions if needed, but just kind of to touch on the question of kind of where does this data go and how does it actually feed up into the higher level policy objectives? This data can support action across a number of different avenues. And so it really can, range from direct guidance on leaks to informing best practices, to identifying policy and regulatory gaps, and informing and improving inventory estimates among other uses. And so that's really, really important to kind of see how this data at the point source level can really feed in and support some of the other types of data that the systems are collecting. And so just to kind of leave you all with a bit of a sense of the scope of kind of what will be emerging in the next few years, which you all know, but just from a policy perspective, the growth and improvements of satellite observations are going to really build on the existing ecosystems of observations from satellites like DRCOMI and EMIT to fill more and more of these data gaps globally. And so what that means is that there's going to be more focus on key regions globally, so probably areas like Russia and China, more focus on enabling subnational actors and local decision makers, and as Laika mentioned, actually enabling access to data that a lot of countries and regional partners just would not have the capability to be able to access otherwise. And so for Carbon Mapper, we actually will be leveraging data we have some regional airborne campaigns, as well as analyzing some of the data from the NASA EMIT mission this year. And then we'll be building on those observations once our Carbon Mapper coalition satellites are launched. And these observations are really intended to provide new insights and point source and understanding of point sources globally. And we're really we are also working, as I mentioned before, to support the global methane pledge waste pathway that the State Department announced. And so what we're doing as part of that is to work to conduct a global baseline assessment of high emission waste sites globally. And so this work will dramatically scale up insights into methane emissions for the sector and really support a lot of work that's also ongoing and just kind of provide a better understanding and help countries and operators and municipalities prioritize where investments and action should take place. And broadly speaking, that's true of a lot of these sectors. So as these observations continue, there's just going to be more information, and that's why it's really helpful to bring together all these different actors to help sort through the information and try to actually turn it into things that decision makers can actually access and understand. And so what's really exciting about the kind of increased attention on methane is that it's also aligning to where there's going to be this massive amount of global data at the point source and area source levels coming online that's going to shape the policy landscape in really fundamental ways. And this really isn't an accident. It's really built on the insights and planning from experts and programs that have come out of programs like CMS. So you all know a lot about that as well. But these will have huge implications for the discussions at COP, both 28 and 29, because as we see more, we'll be able to do more, and that's really huge. And so with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Debbie.
Thank you, Kenzie. Debbie.
Hey, let's see if I can do this as well as Kenzie did. No. Let's see. What are you seeing?
We see your computer and the slides, and you can just hit on presentation.
That? Or no? Are you seeing my screen?
You
You're
can
not
click
seeing
on use a slideshow on the there.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Yeah, and I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'll try to be fast here. So as Kenzie was saying, all eyes really are on methane. And I think that the goal of the next several COPs is going to make progress on methane in a decade, basically by 2030, using all of the climate intelligence that everyone listening here has brought to the table on CO2 over the past generation. So there's really an accelerated move toward this climate intelligence using satellite technology and climate science. How will this resonate at COP28? That I think is really the wild card here. I mean, we're doing COP28 is at UAE. So we're talking about the Middle East, home to oil and gas. Methane is mostly gas. So the real challenge, I think, at COP28 is going to be more of a political challenge. It's already started to hit the airwaves, where there's a sense of, can we wrestle with short-term action, which is a lot of what both Leica and Kenzie were talking about, to dial down emissions, say, from methane, as opposed to just focusing on net zero goals, which is the long-term aspiration for where we want to get and where all the IPCC models go to the year 2100. Because when you're in a place like the Middle East, you're really talking about markets that are functioning very well, and it's going to be very difficult. At the same time, the IPCC really has said and believes we can have emissions by 2030. So there are some real goals there, both with the stocktake and the global methane pledge. So why do methane and even, I would say, SO2 deserve all of the attention that they're getting? Methane is extremely impactful, especially in the short term, over 80 times. Avoiding a ton of methane is avoiding about 120 tons of CO2. And the IPCC finds that the uncertainties and the bands of both methane and sulfur dioxide rival CO2. So these are really important for the tipping that could potentially be starting to go on in the climate. So RMI is focused primarily on oil and gas. We're also starting to work on some of the effects of coal bed methane, and then also the waste sectors with the study that we're doing with Carbon Mapper. Interestingly, our theory of change, which I'll go through quickly here, is very similar to Mars in terms of the observing system and the idea here that Mars will look to detect and attribute. We're very much focused on visibility. We'll notify and leverage. That's all of the accounting and the attribution work that has to go on the ground once you see emissions from satellites and from space, and then abating and bringing into the market decisions to actually motivate the maybe even prevention rather than reduction of emissions over time. But I do think this idea of everything that NASA has been doing, and now some private, GHGSat is an example, or nonprofit, Carbon Mapper satellites are doing, is this question of visibility, which is the game changer. It's going to put satellites front and center. And I will say prepare, this will come up at COP28, but I think in the future as more satellites launch, prepare for disruption, because the more eyes there are in the sky, the more political and the more difficult this gets, because reputations are at risk, whether this is from a country's point of view, think Russia, think Saudi Arabia, or whether this is from a company's point of view, whether it's an oil and gas company, or even in terms of waste or in agriculture. Kenzie went through this, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things on this and why CMS and contributors are so important right now, because there are still breakthroughs to be made. Amazing that we can now see methane over water with glint mode. That was a breakthrough. That's fantastic. I think that there are going to need to be breakthroughs in terms of visibility at the poles. And then we still have the issue of cloud cover to work through of what we can see. So in terms of making emissions visible, it's not as if we stop here. I think that this whole idea of making actors on the ground aware of what we're seeing and how to respond to that, but also in terms of continually improving the ability to be infinitely visible. In terms of the work RMI does and how this dovetails into the quantification or the top-down analysis, we for the past decade have been modeling, using engineering-based models, modeling the activity of oil and gas on the grounds. And what we're finding, having modeled about 2/3 of the world's oil and gas at this point of all supplies, is that methane emissions are responsible for about 1/2 of total life cycle industry emissions, which is huge. So if we can reduce that methane or prevent it from leaking from oil and gas systems, this is compressors, this is tanks, this is, everywhere in the built system, this will make a huge impact in terms of reducing climate change in the short term. And Kenzie mentioned the work we're doing with Carbon Mapper is all about replicating the work I just showed you for oil and gas, replicating that for the waste sector in terms of modeling waste emissions and then mapping waste emissions and using satellites to continue to detect waste. This is a really big issue in the global south. It is an issue everywhere, but it's especially an issue in the global south where there's a lot of unmanaged waste that goes into or sits on the land and degrades and just leaks methane. So lastly, what conversations can we expect, or even I was talking to Adil about this, what conversations can CMS drive at COP28? It would be fantastic to have more of everyone in this room and CMS stakeholders involved at COP28 if you're not already. But this whole idea of funding public methane monitoring to spot leakage to increase transparency is going to be amazing. As Kenzie said, a lot of this work has been done on the backs of philanthropy to kick up, but we really need big bucks in terms of global public funding to do this. Tracking the assets and ownership and operation on the ground, it's great to see something from the sky, but who are you going to talk to when you've seen it? That's been a real stop or an interruption for what we have to do. We don't have really great, quick information on who's operating and knowing how to get to those folks. So tracking and quantifying those emissions is going to be incredibly important, both for stopping emissions, but even for the global stock take. Establishing methane markets, using certification, using methane pricing, like in the Inflation Reduction Act, bringing all of this action into finance, bringing it into economics is going to be crucial, especially when you're talking about places like the Middle East, that this is a monetizable. Oil and gas are money. And then lastly, everything that CMS can do in terms of continuing to advance climate models, to prepare for multiple operational satellites saying different things so that decision makers understand why there are differences in what's being observed from the sky. And then the very big question in terms of developing accords on net negative emission technologies, solar geoengineering, methane removal. There's just a lot going on in this space in terms of climate alignment that necessarily bring everything that NASA is doing into the conversation. So with that, I will stop sharing here and we can turn it back over to Adil.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you, Kenzie, and thank you, Debbie, for kind of summarizing and finalizing the presentation with a couple of action items that we can do from the side of CMS. We're good on time. We're gonna have a Q&A with speakers. So I have a couple of questions on the chat box. You can post your questions on the chat, but also I'll give time for people to unmute and do their questions directly to Debbie and Kenzie. So Jocelyn Angel Lopez asks, and I think this is for Debbie, are you considering tracking oil and gas carrier vessel routes?
Yeah, so in two different ways. We model them as part of what I was showing you, which is called the oil climate index plus gas. So we do model the whole life cycle of oil and gas, including oil pipelines, LNG, liquefied natural gas shipments, all the ways that oil and gas move through the economy. And that is actually not through us, but through one of our, what Leica was talking about, Climate Trace, that we are part of. We provide Climate Trace, the upstream emissions, but the transport emissions that actually track the movement are done by Ocean Mind, and it lives on the Climate Trace website right now. So the answer is yes. And what we could do is change input assumptions and project emissions going forward with the models in that regard, in terms of the movement of oil and gas.
Thank you, Debbie. And this question can go to both. We're talking about the reduction of methane levels by 30% by 2030. So there are two questions. Michael asked, like, since the studies have indicated that the 2020 methane levels have been underestimated, is reducing emissions 30% by 2030 really enough, or should it be scaled to, say, 50%? And also, in that sense, Kevin Bowman asks, if we take the 30% reduction in methane, what will the reduction in temperature be?
So as I understand it, and Kenzie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that this global methane pledge is aiming, which is the 30% by 2030 reduction in methane, is aiming to get about 0.2 or 0.3 degrees of warming out of the climate. And definitely a deal in order to make a much more meaningful impact, we're talking 50% reduction by 2030. So, there's much more needed, but I think to get the pledge signed by 150 countries, the idea was to get it in, and that meant not going for, the final, bottom line here. But I do want to just raise another quick question here that I've had. I'm working on doing a study now about this. The idea of sequencing here, I think, is really critical too, because the methane is warming, and there's been a lot of questions about gas being a bridge fuel, getting off coal and having gas being a bridge fuel. But coal, as horrible as it is, and as bad as it is for public health, the SO2 from coal does mask warming. So we're at about, 1.8 degrees of warming in reality right now, but we're masking 0.4 of it with SO2 or with sulfate aerosol. So the idea of having non-leaky gas systems, if there's any gas in the economy, is critical, because if we get off coal and we replace it with leaky gas, we're going to see a real unmasking of additional warming very quickly, which is going to be very dangerous for the climate.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, so we're going to open now for anyone that wants to. You can raise your hand or just unmute and do the question directly to Debbie or Kenzie. Let's see if we have anyone. Or if not, and we have
I have a question, Adil.
Yes, Kevin. Yeah, you can go ahead, Kevin.
I'm trying to pull it up. Thanks, everyone, for this really exciting presentation. I think you commented on briefly the role of there's the country governance, and there's also the role of corporate interaction. How do you see? Can you elaborate maybe on the way you see perhaps corporate, particularly multinational corporations, which have very long international supply chains, interacting with these new data sets, and in order for them to better do reporting, for example, to their SEC or for their climate descriptions?
Kenzie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first, but I will defer to Debbie on a very important element on that, which is measuring methane intensity across supply chains, which is also really critical for that type of reporting. So this is where the tiered observing system strategy and the system of systems is critical, because there is not one technology or approach that can see the whole system and do all the emissions measurements in one. And so efforts like Carbon Mapper, where we can really see the point source data, that is going to be needed to be integrated into how companies think about their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emission data sets. And so this is where we do get into this broader question around data integration, and especially for corporates. But they've been thinking of, there are a lot of efforts out there that are both tackling that to kind of say, hey, how can we bring this data together to help inform? But data sets like Carbon Mapper can feed into others that then would get, the attribution to operator is really important for that. And so as Debbie noted, like once we get into attribution for operators, especially with policy implications or reporting implications, that's a whole other beast. But it's coming. And so I think that this is where there's some kind of smaller steps where these types of observations in the US, so for example, oil and gas companies have to report major emission events. And so as these operations see more of those events that maybe aren't reported, that's going to start to really create a more robust approach by both corporates as well as government agencies in understanding those emissions and integrating them into their own reporting. And I think that's kind of where what we're going to see, this is kind of my opinion, is that as there's more visibility from these data sets about emissions that probably aren't captured in that reporting, it's going to kind of force industry and corporates to start thinking about and integrating emissions that people are starting to see. And so it's going to be an evolution, but it's definitely going to push, I think, both parties to better understand what the total emissions are from a visibility perspective and a data integration perspective, as well as kind of like have corporates better understand and better report on what they actually are emitting. And so I think, and especially with the SEC rule, so I came from the private sector at JP Morgan, they built it in a way to allow companies to kind of do this process of emissions. I mean, companies have been reporting on their emissions for a long time, voluntarily in some ways. So now this is a new way to do do reporting from public sector companies, especially in the US. But they've built it in a way where I think it's going to be an evolution as these types of data sets and observations come into play and people better understand what those emissions are. I hope that kind of answered the question. But Debbie, I think if you want to talk a little bit about the supply chain elements, I think that's also really important to corporate emissions reporting.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the supply chain for oil and gas especially is really complicated because there are producers and those are different companies than the midstream operators, and then they go to plants that are owned by yet another, sometimes series of operators, and then they go, onward to utilities, if it's gas, for example. So you've got a lot of handoff that goes off in the sector. So figuring out where the leak is and who's responsible becomes infinitely important. But I also wanted to draw a distinction because I think it will be important for action on corporates. So you have the state-owned enterprises, which are countries, and they own 80% of the world's oil and gas, for example, and they operate much of the world's waste, for example, and agriculture for that matter. They basically are the corporates in countries that are state-owned. Then you have the corporates, the IOCs that Kevin was asking about. And I think there, a lot of this data will become very impactful because of reputational risk. And then thirdly, incredibly important, the more I go out and there and talk about it, this is Kenzie's world, the finance sector is so hungry for this data. They've signed on to net zero banking initiatives and they don't operate, they lend money. And they actually debt service. And it ends up that they care a lot about this. And it's not even a direct reputational risk. It's more information to guide them on who to do business with.
And a lot, to Debbie's point, a lot of financial institutions set financing targets. So similar to corporate setting net zero targets in their operations, financial institutions set financing targets. And those financing targets, a lot of the majors have methane sub-targets, specifically for the oil and gas sector. So it's very important there as well.
Thank you, Debbie, Kenzie. Anyone else wants to make a question or comment directly to Debbie or Kenzie?
I just put my hand up, Adil.
Peter, yes, I didn't see.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Debbie, trying to think of, it's nice to see you. Trying to think of a diplomatic way of asking this in not in a not too snarky fashion. But when you're talking about the reputational risks, and you mentioned the UAE, and I think you mentioned Russia, uh, both on a national and on an international stage, have been very clear about their reputations. I'm, there are particularly Russia, doing things internationally that establish what sort of actor they are in international stage. So I just want to not push back, but ask you to say a little bit more about what sort of reputational risks you think some of these actors actually would care about, I guess is the way to say it.
It's a great question. And I do think this is unfolding in real time, obviously, geopolitically in the world. But first of all, the Middle East believes they will be the last man standing when it comes to oil and gas. So their reputations matter a lot. And in fact, I know Saudi Aramco is very keen on having a, premium for being a low greenhouse gas intensity oil producer, and Qatar is probably not that far behind. Others like Norway rival them, but they can actually market themselves based on being lower climate intensity producers of equivalent barrels. Russia is interesting. I mean, right now it's a whole different story, but before Ukraine was invaded by them, they were very much aligned and fed by the international oil companies. BP was in there, Exxon was in there. They need technology to keep going forward, or else their oil fields, they're tough. Like those conditions are bad. So I don't know where Russia will be in the future, but I do think that it's a dotted line to reputational risk, even though it's Russia.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter and Debbie. We have like 5 more minutes. I have like, I think, 2 questions on the chat box, but yeah, let's go to John.
Hi, thanks again for this presentation. So there's a lot of focus on the fossil side of the methane budget, but of course, livestock waste and rice are just as important, if not more so. So what can you say about the efforts to mitigate that side of the methane budget
Yeah,
in
so
terms of remediation efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I could start, Kenzie, and then kick it off to you because I have a very quick answer to this, which is I think that the carbon mappers and other satellites with super emitters out there are going to help countries, thinking of the global methane pledge, countries decide what their priority is. So when you see, like, why should India care that much about oil and gas? Maybe not. Maybe they need to care a lot more about livestock. So it's going to help divide up and prioritize where the countries work. I don't know what else, Kenzie, you think.
Yeah, I do think that that's a big focus, and it's actually something where carbon mapper is not optimized to see kind of diffuse area sources from things like rice cultivation. So that's where there's some challenge. Like this is where, as we talked about, it takes a system of systems to observe and better understand these emissions. But for those types of sources, this is where the some of the work I was talking about, where philanthropy kind of stepped in. A lot of the work by Global Methane Hub and the work that they're supporting with partners on the ground is to tackle solutions and policies around exactly those sources in key regions, where, as Debbie notes, it is the primary focus for them in their country because it does kind of depend. And so I think that there is a lot of focus on that, but as Debbie notes, it is kind of regionally specific. And especially when we were talking about waste, we can see a lot of the large super emitters, but there's a lot of interconnected social, political, and economic challenges in tackling those types of challenge or those types of emissions. And you get into agriculture, it's the same. So that's where, those are a little bit of a not more thorny, but they're thornier policy avenues that I think take a lot of collaboration with a lot of different partners on the ground. And there is a lot of work underway, but it doesn't quite bubble up to some of these larger initiatives. But you should look at the global waste pathway initiatives that the State Department announced, because food and ag is a major thrust of that work.
And John, I'll just add one last thought, which is the reason why oil and gas it has been the number one priority is because, and IEAs keep showing this over and over, at these prices of natural gas and of oil, it can become profitable or at least net, not cost you anything to not leak your gas, to not leak your methane. And I think that's why oil and gas, as an early adopter of these technologies, has been such a focus because they can market what they don't leak, what they don't waste.
Thank you, Debbie and Kenzie. I want to address, and we had planned for this, so we're staying a couple of more minutes, and we'll end. Ned, I think you raised your hand, right? So we'll end with you. But first, Debbie and Kenzie, if you can address very quickly these two questions. This is a great question from John Driscoll, kind of like an example. How will the LNG importer constellation make modifications to operations to reduce emissions of methane from processes, and who will be the agency to enforce? And then from Jocelyn, how open or accessible will these data products be for governments or public institutions to assess, regulate, and manage leaks and emissions? And I mean, we're talking here about data products like the ones from Carbon Mapper.
I could take the first, Kenzie, if you want to take the second. On the LNG supply chain, what's really interesting, and it's not necessarily, well, it cuts both ways, actually. It could be helpful or harming. LNG has allowed gas to go global. It should be gas is now poised to cross $1 trillion in trade this year. I mean, this gas was regional forever until, LNG is taking off. And so it's making gas more like oil. And so it answers the question a little bit in terms of LNG terminals. Now it's a lot like shipping terminals for crude. Like you have to wonder and worry and measure and monitor and have reporting the liquefaction terminal, well, the pipelines to the liquefaction terminal, and then you have the shipping, so it doesn't boil off and leak when it's in the ocean, and then you have regasification. So it starts to complicate things because now you have different regulatory bodies, just a lot like airlines maybe, or like oil crude shipping is right now. You have a lot of bodies that are responsible for a supply chain that's no longer within country. And with pipelines, gas used to transport only in country. So it really is opening up the door where satellites will be even more important for a growing LNG supply chain.
And Edel, can you remind me what the second question was? I'm so sorry. Is
Yes.
it the one about open and accessible data
Right.
in the chat?
Right.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome. Yeah, so this is what's really interesting about the initiatives that are coming online. So Carbon Mapper, our data will be fully accessible on our global data or our data portal on our website. That's features on our website after 90 days of observation. So there's a little bit of a data lag. But there's a lot of other groups like Methane Sat by EDF that's also going to be putting out a lot of data. So there's a lot of access to this data that groups like Climate Trace and others are going to be taking in. And then there's also a lot of access by private sector groups that are also providing data, but those are not quite as accessible, but can be accessed if there's, contracts in place. But I think that these different systems are coming together to really build on those, to fill those gaps on the data side. But it is really great to see a number of initiatives where the data will actually be public and can start to actually feed into these types of decision-making processes and inventories and such in a really publicly and transparent way. So I think that answers the question, but can dive in more.
Thank you, Kenzie. And we're going to finish with the question from Ned.
Well, if we have time, I was going to just ask a question, especially for the sort of more dispersed methane emissions problem, what the state of the open science community is around this. It's something we're working on. I think for so much proprietary money is going into sensing and AIs to solve problems like point source emissions. But the more diffuse stuff requires, I think, a different approach. I'm just curious what the open science community is looking like and whether people are getting into collaborating, creating a commons of data versus trying to monetize the proprietary information.
I wouldn't say net on the informational side. I would say that the diffuse methane, this comes from coal mines, this comes from ag. It comes also from natural sources, like, when you have wetlands. The work that's going on right now, and I don't know if folks on the webinar, any of you are part of it, but it's all around methane removal. So there's more work going on now, Spark Climate and others, in terms of trying to figure out how you actually remove methane from the atmosphere, because some of these very diffuse sources are very hard to capture and stop because they happen over huge land areas and they're very low concentration, but they amount to something much bigger in the aggregate. So I think that technology in that regard is really pushing on helping in terms of that.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you so much again to everyone that joined, especially Debbie and Kenzie for staying a couple of more minutes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, be in the lookout. We have a couple of events coming up this year. Next month, we're going to be in Salt Lake City with this Applied Earth Observation Innovation Partnership. CMS is going to be there. Then in late September, we're going to have the science team meeting, and we'll have a panel like this on COP, preparing for COP28. So thank you again to Debbie, Kenzie, Leka that had to go away before the end. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.